Amen.
All right, so last week we talked a lot about Galatians 6 and the law of Christ, and I summarized that with this graphic, and I'm just going to leave it up there. I'm not going to read through it, but I did point out last week that Paul coined the phrase or the term the law of Christ. It's the only place that you see it in the Bible. And if you remember, the Galatians were wanting to add the requirements of the law. And so Jesus said that, or Paul, sorry, said that the Galatians were under the law of Christ and not the law of the old covenant. And that's a good thing, because the trespasses and the lust of the flesh that Paul was addressing to the Galatian church, the things that God is long suffering with in his people now under the new covenant, many of those things required the death penalty. So Paul was going, be careful what you ask for. You want to go back to the law? Well, guess what? You're all going to have to die, because all this stuff is going on, right? So Paul was using that term, the law of Christ, in contrast to the law of Moses, to highlight how grace and mercy allow for learning and growth and maturity. Now, in a sense, we could also look at the law of Christ in comparison to the law of the Pharisees. Not that there is something strictly called the law of the Pharisees in the Bible, but, the Pharisees held other people to a standard that they themselves didn't follow, right? They were essentially a law unto themselves. They made themselves the establishers and the arbiters of a new law, so to speak. Being a law unto themselves, though, they didn't really have the right to define law, because there's only one lawgiver, or there's only ever been one lawgiver. And he's given his law through different means and different people. You remember in Romans 10 we looked at last week, Paul said that the Pharisees were willingly or willfully ignorant of God's righteousness, and they sought their own righteousness, right? He said that they were unwilling to submit to the righteousness of God, and they embellished God's law by adding their own stuff and their own traditions. You don't have to go there, but in Matthew 15:7, Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, and in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men," right? So the Pharisees took the law of Moses and added their own flavor to it, added their own requirements. And what's notable here is that Jesus, in quoting Isaiah, he's applying it to the Pharisees during his lifetime. But when did Isaiah write that? Anybody remember when Isaiah lived? What epoch or what era in biblical history Isaiah lived in?
5,000 years before Christ.
Yeah, it was about 800 years. Like, it was certainly in the 7th century. Isaiah prophesied prior to the Assyrian captivity. Right? So Isaiah prophesied the Assyrian captivity, and later Jeremiah prophesied about the Babylonian captivity. So, Jesus was quoting like 1,000-year-old legacy of people making up their own rules. In reality, the Pharisees were not the initiators of this teaching traditions of men as the doctrines or commandments of God. They just inherited this 1,000-year-old legacy of making up their own stuff. And, that trend of mankind making up their own rules really has been there since when? Yeah, exactly. The garden, right? God surely didn't say blah, blah, blah. So Eve decided to do her own stuff, right? She's like, I'm going to ignore God's commands, right? But, when you talk about, dividing the Bible into these epochs or eras, certainly post-Exodus, post-Mount Sinai, this trend and tendency of God's people to make up their own rules really began in earnest with the split of the kingdom, when Jeroboam took the 10 northern tribes and went north, and he set up his own system of worship and his 2 altars in Samaria, made up his own feast days, and prevented the northern tribes from going to Jerusalem to worship God as God had commanded them. While the Pharisees said, "Do as I say, not as I do," Jesus, however, led by example, didn't he? Jesus said, "Be like me." He said, do as I do as I say. And that means being humble and patient and gentle and long-suffering and at peace with one another. In reality, Jesus showed us how we are to be, and he is the only real and true lawgiver. His words, his new commandments, are not embellishments to the law as the Pharisees' additions were. And in fact, think about this. Like, Jesus repeatedly said that he spoke the words that he heard from his Father, right? So when you think about the Ten Commandments of Christ, whose laws are they?
God's.
They're the Father's, right? Because he only said what the Father told him to say. I want you to go to Matthew chapter 7. I don't know if anybody's expecting me to actually start into the Ten Commandments today, but I'm not going to. Surprise, surprise, right? When you read through chapters 5 through 7, the Ten Commandments themselves are sandwiched in between these two bookends that contain some pretty important messages that I want to look at before we read or look into the commandments themselves. So Matthew chapter 7, we'll start in verse 21. This is where Jesus concludes and gives a summary of his thoughts given the fact that he had just finished the Ten Commandments. So Matthew 7:21 says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven." Right? And so this goes back to what we just said, that Jesus spoke the words that reflected the will of the Father. So even though we called them the Ten Commandments of Christ, what we're hearing are the words of the Father. Right? This is what the Father wants, and he's speaking through his Son. Verse 22, "Many will say to me in that day, 'Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name?' And then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" Now focus on that phrase there, or that word lawlessness, right? You who practice lawlessness. Last week we went to Galatians 5 and I showed you how Paul described three different kinds of Christians, right? There's the pneumatikos, the nephios, and the sarkanos. And so these carnal Christians, the sarkanos, these are Christians who practice the lusts of the flesh. And Paul said, guess what? You're not getting in. Even though you're doing things in the name of Christ, even though you may have accepted him as your Savior and you've been baptized, if you continue to practice the lust of the flesh, if you practice lawlessness, then entrance to the kingdom will be removed. In fact, you will be disinherited, would be a different way to say that. So for you and I, our lives will be characterized by one of two things, right? We're either practicing the commandments and the laws of Christ, or we're practicing lawlessness. And we get to choose. We get to choose our lifestyle, whether we are law followers and lawful, or we are lawless. But even though we get to choose the type of life we live, we don't get to choose the outcome. Because the outcome is predetermined by the man who made the law, the Father. He continues on in verse 24. He says, "Therefore, whoever does these sayings of mine," and remember, we're at the end of the Ten Commandments of Christ. So when he says, "whoever does these sayings of mine," he's referring back to everything he's taught from the beginning of Matthew 5 up to this point in Matthew 7. So whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, but it didn't fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings, referring to the totality of Matthew 5 all the way up to this point in Matthew 7, that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes. So here's a question, because it says, everyone who hears and either does or does not do the sayings that he's just gone through. Who is the everyone who hears? Who's he talking to?
You have to have Christians who are going to be able to hear these things. You have somebody who lives way out in the jungle somewhere and they never hear these things. How are they going to know what to obey?
Yeah, and we're going to try to deal with a question like that at the very end of the series.
He's talking to his disciples here.
Well, so in the moment, he's speaking to the people who are listening, right? And if you go back to the beginning of chapter 5, where it introduces this whole section, he's talking to his disciples, but there's a multitude of people that are listening, right? So in the moment, it's the people who are present on the Mount, on the Sermon on the Mount. But, we are his disciples as well, right? So for us today, we are either people who hear and do, or people who hear and do not do. And we'll leave the question about what about those who don't hear and either do or do not do things that are consistent with the character of God. Right? The ones like you and I who later read the Gospels and follow the works of the apostles, ultimately the question is this. When he says, for those who hear and don't do, is he talking to anyone different than those who hear and do the sayings?
I think it's a warning to the people that are listening to make sure that they follow his commandments.
Right? Absolutely. So let's transport that concept to modern day. Is Jesus talking here to believers or unbelievers?
Believers.
It is, right? And I think there's like a twofold application here, right? I think it certainly is a general warning to anybody who may not be a believer, who might be reading the Bible and they're seeking and they're reading, but they're not yet a Christian. And it's kind of like a basic, hey, listen, this is what you're getting into. If you hear what I say and you don't do, you're not getting into the kingdom. But if you hear what I say and then you follow through and you're consistent and you practice it, then guess what? The inheritance is going to be shared with you. But more specifically, as you guys just said, this warning is to believers. Now, there's very little in the Bible that's written to anyone outside the sphere of God's people, right?
Steve?
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to make a point here. In the Sermon on the Mount, in the beginning, Jesus, seeing the multitude, went up on the mountain to get away from the multitude.
Right.
So he would teach his disciples a private teaching. Now, it so happens that the crowd kind of got up there and started listening to him.
Yes.
But his intention was not addressing the crowd. He was giving his disciples specific teachings for them, which would then apply to believers.
Yes, and probably the best way to frame that is to look at the Great Commission and saying, Jesus said, go out into the world and baptize believers, teaching them the things that I have taught you. And that would include the Sermon on the Mount, right? So by extension, because we're following the teachings of the apostles, he's speaking to us, but he's doing it indirectly, right? And that's why I tried to, maybe I wasn't clear, but I tried to point that distinction out just a little bit earlier. But, recognize that what I said just a moment ago, very, very little of the book is written to anyone outside the sphere of God's people. Now, there are certainly many parts of the Bible that are written strictly as historical record that anybody could read, or it's not addressed to anyone other than someone who's maybe interested. Let's talk about the Old Testament. Some of the books are just strictly, like Kings and Chronicles. There's not a lot of doctrine that you can derive from that. It's not a lot of instruction, say on Christian morality or behavior. There's lots of examples of what went wrong, but it's more history. And we even would look at something like the book of Acts as more of a historical record rather than a doctrinally driven book compared to, say, Galatians or Ephesians or Revelation, right? And there might be some exceptions, like the prophecy in Isaiah about Cyrus. Clearly that was put in there so that at some point, because God speaks to Cyrus directly, I call you by name so that you will know. So that was intended to be shared with him, even though he was a pagan, right? even though the Bible is written for anybody to read, for anyone to read, it's written to believers. So all of these warnings about hearing and not doing, or hearing or doing, right? You get to choose your lifestyle. You're either lawless or lawful. The outcome of those two paths are predetermined. You can choose your path, but you can't choose the destination other than by choosing the right path. You know, we're not there yet, but as Walter just said, in Matthew 5:1, as we see the Sermon on the Mount beginning, Jesus is teaching his disciples. He's having, what might have been intended as a private conversation. And in fact, this sermon is the first group teaching that's recorded in the Bible after Jesus called the 12 apostles. It's the first time he gathers them all together and says, listen, this is what we're all about. Right? And even though, and even I have it on the, if you go back here for a second, if I look at, the title slide, it shows Jesus and it looks like he's addressing, like most of the pictures that relate to or try to convey the Sermon on the Mount have Jesus speaking to the masses. But it really was let's call it a semi-private audience where Jesus was directly teaching his apostles and the multitudes were listening in. Eavesdropping, that's right. So, we begin by understanding how important it is for the believer to adhere to the sayings of Christ. In essence, the Father speaking his instructions and his commandments and his rules to his Son, who speaks to his disciples, who then speak to us, and we have the benefit of the words of Christ being recorded for us. These sayings are the key to the kingdom. They are the will of the Father. And last week we talked a lot about being a slave, being a servant, that when, prior to coming to Christ, we were slaves to unrighteousness and sin. We were slaves to the lust of the flesh. And then when we trade that, we're trading masters. We're still slaves. The question is, who are we slaves to? And, understanding the commandments, the 10 commandments of Christ, and, what sometimes is summed up in just the phrase, the word, which in many cases just encompasses, if it's not referring to Christ as the word of truth, it basically encompasses all the things that Jesus has shared with his disciples, who then shared it with us. And if we put the 10 commandments into that context, that this is the will of the Father spoken through the Son, and following that will, being lawful rather than lawless, is how we get into the kingdom. That's how important these 10 commandments are that we're going to go through eventually. We'll get there, I promise. Back up to Matthew chapter 5. So that was one bookend at the end of the 10 commandments. Let's go to the bookend that's right before it. We're going to go Matthew 5:13. This is very familiar. This is the whole salt and light discussion, right? And this is right before he launches into the 10 commandments themselves, and Jesus is setting the stage, and he's giving some context as to why what follows is important. One reason is, if you don't follow these things, you don't get into the kingdom. If you do, you will. But here he says this in verse 13, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." Now again, he's talking to the disciples, but we follow the disciples' example, so these words are also for us by extension. So here are the common questions that come out. We're just going to go through this, and I'm fairly certain that you guys know the answers to this, but let's start with salt. What is salt used for?
Cooking.
Preservative.
Yeah, so we have two things, right? It's a seasoning that enhances flavor, but if you have a lot of salt, you can basically preserve things and prevent rot and decay. So a little bit of salt seasons things, a lot brings preservation. So what happens when salt isn't salty?
It has no flavor.
Yeah, and it loses its flavor, and it's indistinguishable as salt. And if there's no saltiness, then you can not only no, that's a double or a triple negative. That's not going to work. You can't season something if the salt isn't salty, but you also can't preserve things, right? So you lose flavor, you lose distinguishability, and then decay begins to set in. And so these are obviously metaphors, and it's talking about the nature of a Christian and a Christian's life. What happens when a Christian loses his or her saltiness? Or maybe it's better to say, what is your saltiness?
That's probably a good expression to say to one another. Stay salty.
Stay salty. But what is it? I mean, what is he referring to here? And what is it? What happens if we lose our saltiness?
Just like everyone else is indistinguishable, we're indistinguishable from the people of the world, and we need to be different. And that salt adds that flavor. With bland food, you add a little bit of salt to it, and it brings out the flavor of the original vegetables and everything, and meat.
Right. Yeah, I'll point this out a little bit later, but it seems to me that what Jesus is talking about here is, the thing that sets us apart from the world is the word of truth. And I'll show you that in John 15 and John 17. But you know what? Jesus is very specific in verse 13. Just look at it again. What happens if you lose your saltiness?
It's good for nothing but thrown out and trampled underfoot of men.
That's a pretty dire warning, isn't it? If
Yeah.
you are a Christian who practices lawlessness, you lose the kingdom. If you lose your saltiness and you are indistinguishable from the world, then you're no good and you'll be trampled underfoot by men. Were you going to say something else, Walter?
Yeah. When you look at this of salt, I also akin it to being something of value, of importance, that he's addressing us as believers that we have. He's not saying unbelievers don't have it, but he's just showing that we're the salt of the earth, because we have that message that seasons and preserves.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Now, Mary said just a moment ago that we need to be distinguishable from the world. There's a very common saying in the Christian subculture that sums up this idea that we are to stand out and not blend in. Can anyone tell me what that is?
There's a saying that says, you're not worth your salt.
Yeah, not what I'm thinking about, but I get you. Have you heard the phrase "in the world but not of it"?
Right.
What verse is that? Yeah, it's a trick question because that's not actually in the Bible. Now, the ideas are there, right? There's no single verse that actually says we are in the world, not of it. It's just a compilation of two different trains of thought. For example, in John 15:19, I'm not going to go there, but you can write it down and look at it later if you want. John 15:19, he's talking to his disciples again, and he says, if you were of the world would love you. Yet because you are not of the world, on the contrary, I chose you out of the world, therefore the world will hate you. Right? So this is where the idea of not being of the world comes from, is from this. And there are other verses that kind of hint at it, but it's kind of stated specifically there, we are not of this world. But I will tell you, and as I studied this idea and thought about it over the last week, this idea that we are in the world but not of it, I became increasingly dissatisfied with that. And I'm going to ask you if you can just pause for a second and think about that phrase, in the world not of it, and see if you can guess why I'm not happy with that as it stands.
What do you mean by you're not happy with that?
No, that's the whole point. You got to guess.
Well,
we're in the world, we're essentially of it.
Well, I think there's a distinction, right? Because it's like the whole translation, or not the translation, but the whole point of the saying is, yeah, we live in the world, but we're not like the world. And in fact, the word that's translated as world, the Greek word is cosmos. And it doesn't refer to the world as in the globe, the earth, whatever. That word cosmos, at its fundamental meaning, talks about like like a system, an organization. And in this context, it refers to the rules and the ways of society. Would probably be a good way. I mean, it could be used. The Greek word cosmos could be used for the stars and the constellations. That's how we would use the transliterated word cosmos. But it can refer to like a city layout, or like a judicial system, right? So we live in the world, but we don't function like the world functions, right? We don't conform to societal norms because it's so counter to, I'm going to use the word Jesus culture. But
Yeah.
why? Go ahead, Walter.
Because when he's saying that, what I see is that he's not compared, like you said. It's not. Yes, we're in the world, and we actually were of the planet because we were made from the dust of the earth. But his point, I believe, in my opinion, is what he's saying. You're not of this world system, of the pagan system.
Right.
That's not the system that you're part of. You're not of that, of all these pagans and their worldly cultural system.
Right. So here's the question: Is it satisfactory just to be in the world, not be of it, but just to be in the world?
No.
Why not?
Because you're not doing the will of God.
That's it. That's exactly it. Right. As I kept thinking about this, I realized that phrase "in the world but not of it" is just way too passive, because it has nothing to do with our mission, with the Great Commission. Right? Like, just hang out doing whatever you like, as long as you're not in the world, then everything's cool. And I don't think that that's accurate. As Jesus said in the Salt and the Light passage, a city on the hill can't be hidden. He said, "Let your light so shine before men that they see your good works and glorify the Father." Salt doesn't season anything until it's mixed with something that lacks flavor. So being simply in the world is too passive, and it's insufficient. And it doesn't reflect or suggest our calling. Go to John chapter 17.
While we're doing this, like, people have the attitude, well, I got my ticket. That's all I need. I'm good.
Yeah, it's almost like and I'm totally guilty of this, right? It's almost like armchair Christianity. It's like, the guy who sits back and watches Sunday Night Football and yells at the ref and the coaches, and why did you do that? And they would have done, I would have done this, and I would have made that call, and that call was wrong. They're not down on the field. They're just sitting watching the television, right? It's easy to be a coach when you're not actually a coach. John 17:14. Now, this is the night before Jesus died, right? Jesus prayed that his disciples would be sanctified by the truth of God's word. So John 17:14 says, "I have given them your word." And that's one of those phrases, one of these instances where that phrase, "your word," just sums up the totality of the teachings that Christ had come to give, to teach the will of the Father. "I've given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil." Now, if you have a King James or New King James, it probably says the evil one. If it does, cross out the word one, because it doesn't belong. I don't want to get too grammatically technical here, but the evil is it's an articular adjective. It's actually got the definite article "the" with an adjective, which is evil. And what it refers to, a lot of translations put the evil one because there's a misunderstanding that this is referring to Satan, right? That you should keep them from Satan. But that grammatically doesn't work, because the word "from" literally means out from within. It's the Greek preposition ek. And so he's not going to be praying that, "Father, I pray that you would keep them out from within Satan." right? That just doesn't even make sense on a conceptual basis. Rather, keep them from the evil refers to the wicked as a class of unrighteous people from which we are set apart.
You would, for me, it'd be more like saying you should keep them from the evil of the world.
That is a potential translation as well.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the only reason I say that, again, not to get too grammatically detailed, the word evil agrees with the word world in terms of gender and number. They're both singular masculine nouns. And the evil is in the genitive case. So it would be from the evil of something else. So I think either way you arrive at the same place, whether you say from the evil of the world, and literally, what is the evil of the world? What is the evil that the world produces, the world system produces?
Lawlessness?
Yes, but lawlessness without an agent is just a notion, right? Do you understand what I mean?
Okay, it's the wickedness of the men.
It's the wickedness of the people who are lawless. That's what a lawless system produces. That's what the world produces, is unrighteous, wicked people. And that's the world that we're sent into, right? And let's continue on here in verse 16. Well, let me go back and read 15. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil, the wicked, the unrighteous, the evil and unrighteous wickedness of the world, however you want to say that. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. So how are we set apart from the evil of the world and the wicked and unrighteous people?
By our obedience to God and our walk with Christ in holiness.
But how do we know what to do to be obedient? It says it right here. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth.
By studying His word, obedient to His word.
Right, that's exactly it, right? So Jesus says in verse 14, I have given them your word. In verse 17, he says, your word is truth. And it's the word of God, the Father's truth, that we hold that sets us apart from the wicked generation that the world produces. That's the saltiness right there. The saltiness is the word of truth that makes us different than what the world system produces. Does that make sense? And then he says this, as you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. Now again, he's talking about the disciples right now. The men who would become the apostles, who then would be charged by the same man resurrected to go out into the world, make disciples by baptizing them and teaching them the things that I have taught you, the word of the Father's truth. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they may also be sanctified by the truth. So the saltiness, the thing that distinguishes us from the rest of the world, the things that we are expected to take and to sprinkle around us to season our sphere of influence, is the word of God's truth. And that's the only thing that sets us apart from the wicked and the unrighteous, the product of an evil system, a corrupt system. In John 15, Jesus said, I have chosen you for myself out of the world. And in John 17 that we just read, he said that we're set apart by the truth of God's word that we've been given. But if you don't set that city on a hill, or if you hide that light under the basket, or if you keep your salt to yourself, or you lose your saltiness, what purpose are you serving? You know, I think there's a tendency for anyone who's learning about the Ten Commandments of Christ to just simply go, well, this is just about how I'm supposed to behave. But the last thing Jesus said before he got into commandment number 1 was you got to spread the word of truth. You have to spread the things that my Father has told me that I have told you. Because if you don't, then you're sticking your light under a basket and you've lost your saltiness. And what use do I have for you? This is not just about, Christianity 101 in the sense of these are the instructions of our moral code. It certainly is that, but it goes way beyond that. Because if we don't hold the truth, the word of his truth, and follow it and spread it, we are not his missionaries. And every single one of us are.
By commandment.
By commandment.
Preach.
Jesus didn't choose his disciples out of the world, and by extension you and I, because we follow their tradition. He didn't choose them out of the world to be those armchair athletes or just to sit on the sidelines and watch. Reread verse 18. You sent me into the world. I also have sent them into the world. So we're not just in the world, guys. We're sent into the world. We're sent. Jesus pulled us out. He's training us, and he's sending us back in. And we have a mission.
I apostolo you.
Some people abuse that. I have a relative that would go to Hickory, get out their car, all over the back of the van. You're going to hell if you don't accept Jesus. He would put placards out there and stand on the street corners to spread the gospel. And so many people have done that they've almost turned people off, as by their religious fanaticism, instead of just being waiting for a right opportunity, develop friendship, and take a different approach to spreading the gospel. And that's caused a lot of people to have a really bad impression of evangelism.
Yeah. I was just thinking about the use of salt. Like if, let's say that you go to a restaurant and let's say you order some soup and you taste it and it's a little bland and you're like, oh, it needs some salt. Do you screw the top off and dump the whole salt in, this whole shaker?
A little bit at a time.
Just a little bit at a time, right? And I think evangelism is like that, just like Mary's saying, is that you have to wait for opportune moments. You sprinkle a little salt and then you taste it and go, is that enough or not? And if it's not enough, you sprinkle a little bit more, because if you put too much salt out, you're going to have to put the bowl aside. It will no longer be consumable. There's a big difference between being in the world but not of it and being sent into the world that we are no longer part of. The latter implies that we have a mission, which of course we do, and that is to be that salt and to be that light, to be the kind of fellowship that can't be hidden, that's sitting on a hill. And Jesus also said that the world would know that we are his because of the love that we have for one another. And as Christians, we should be prime examples of kindness and patience and, of course, overall humility. But here's a question, and it's a very important question. Do people need Christ to be humble and kind and patient and nice?
Or do they need Christ in order for those things to occur?
I'm just going to repeat it. Do people need Christ to be humble and kind and patient and nice?
No.
No.
They don't. So just being humble and nice doesn't set you apart. Go to John 1. John 1 verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which gives light, notice this, to every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. Verse 9 is pretty important. Going back, Joe, to that question that you posed, that I said we're going to try to deal with this at the end of the whole series. There is a universal morality that all mankind is born with. Everyone's born with a conscience. And it allows people to act in a Christ-like manner without having Christ in the sense that we know that phrase. And this is why when we look at fundamental morality across cultures and ethnicities. Regardless of religion, we see the same stuff, right? It's not okay to murder, treat people well, don't steal. If you're married, don't cheat on your spouse, honor your mother and your father. Does all that stuff kind of sound familiar? Sounds like the Ten Commandments, doesn't it? Being kind and humble is one thing, but being that and having the word of truth is what sets us apart and makes us different. There are a lot of unbelieving, kind, patient, humble, nice people in the world. I've met them. I have them in my family. But what I have that they don't is the word of truth and all the things that come from that. Now, I'm not saying, this is my big caveat, I'm not saying that being nice gets you into the kingdom. Jesus clearly said that the only way to the Father is through him. And we're going to revisit this whole conversation and try to answer some big questions after we go through all of the Ten Commandments. So that's my teaser to keep you coming back every week.
Except next week.
Yeah, except next week. That's right. Go to verse 17, Matthew 5:17. So right after the salt and the light metaphor, Jesus addresses his role with regards to the law. And this is a critical point for anyone who incorrectly teaches and believes that the new covenant ended the old covenant. Right? Remember that this is the prelude to the Ten Commandments of Christ. Jesus wanted to make sure that his followers knew that he wasn't overturning the law with what he was about to say. Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. And if you didn't know, the jot and the tittle are the smallest marks that you can make in writing Hebrew, right? A jot and a tittle. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, as we have taught for the last several years, the new covenant is the way for individual Jews to escape the curse of the law. But the nation as a whole is still under the curse, which is characterized by the lack of a temple, lack of a functioning priesthood. Right? This means that the old and the covenants are running simultaneously. But clearly, or so clearly, Christ didn't abolish the law because the law is still in effect. Because the nation is in exile, there's no temple, there's no worship. Now, some teach that Jesus added to or made modifications to the law like the Pharisees did. Some teach that these modifications to the law, were instructions to the Jews but not to Christians, and some even blend the two together, saying that Christians have to follow the law, and, it's kind of like the whole Hebrew roots thing. But what does verse 17 say? It says, I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Fulfill what is the question? Because we talk about Christ fulfilling the law, right? What is it when it says, I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill? What is he referring to?
Well, fulfill means to bring to its proper conclusion.
Well, I know that's what it means, but what is he referring to? What needs to be fulfilled?
The prophecies.
So it's two things, right? It's the law and it's the prophets. And that distinction is important because the fulfillment that Christ refers to, I did not come to destroy but fulfill, includes all of the messianic prophecies, some of which are not yet fulfilled. Now, based on what Walter was saying with what fulfill means, like what's the difference between the words destroy and fulfill? What does it mean to destroy something?
To abolish it, to eliminate it.
Yeah, it's gone, right? Dissolve, demolish, destroy. Well, destroy, destroy is destroy. You can't use a word to define the word, but it literally means that, I mean, to, by some means, to bring it to nothingness. But to fulfill, as Walter just said, means something else entirely. The root word is plero, and it can be a noun or a verb. You may have heard us or remember us talking about the word pleroma before, which means fullness, like the measure of the fullness of the stature of Christ. But here it's a verb, right? It's to fulfill as an action, and it means to satisfy, to fill up, to complete, to accomplish, to execute. Meaning to fill up and satisfy, so that the thing that was previously not filled or not complete is now filled, is now complete, but it still remains. If you satisfy and fulfill the law, it doesn't get rid of the law. If the law says don't drive above 50 miles an hour, if I drive at 48, the law doesn't go away. It just means I followed the law. I fulfilled it. But the law is still there. Fulfilling something doesn't destroy it. It doesn't negate it. It simply completes it. It satisfies it. Now, what Jesus completed was, or were, the requirements of the law that lead to the promises of the kingdom. Think about that for a second. There's two parts to the Old Testament law, right? There's the blessings that lead to eternal life, and there's the curse side that lead to death. Jesus completed the requirements of the law and became the path to the blessings of the inheritance. What did he say? I am the way, the truth, and the life. He is the gate through which we enter to get on the narrow path that leads to eternal life. So under the new covenant, the blessings of the kingdom come only through him. And if a Jew is not in Christ, then they're under the curse and they're currently in exile, but they can change sides anytime by dying to the law, as Paul says, and living for God through Christ. Verse 18, he says, "For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled." And, to hammer his point home, he refers to the jot and the tittle, those smallest marks in the Hebrew language, but he says that even the smallest detail will not pass until everything is fulfilled. And again, what is he referring to when he says all is fulfilled? What is the all? Is it just the law? Well, he did that, didn't he? What has to be fulfilled? There's two things. The law, and what else?
The prophets.
Right. So he's got to fulfill both the righteous requirement of the law and all the prophecy that point not just to his death and resurrection, but to his return and to his kingdom. And the Old Testament law is in effect in some capacity until all prophecy is complete. And when will that be? When will all prophecy be fulfilled? Is it when Christ returns and sets up his kingdom?
No.
No, we were just talking about the war of Gog.
Yeah. At the very end.
And at the very end, when death and the grave, the final enemy, are destroyed, that's when everything will be fulfilled. At the end of the 1,000 years. That's when Jesus returns the kingdom back to the Father and said, now it's finished. All the law and all the prophecy has been fulfilled.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When Jesus was growing up, his parents would take their offerings and things up to Jerusalem and everything like that. And they were keeping not only the Ten Commandments, they were keeping the entire law, everything, all 613 parts of it.
Well, they were doing their best.
The best they could. Yeah, so did Elizabeth and whatever. But so he was, from the time he was a child, he was keeping all the points of the law because he lived in the family, his brothers and sisters, his mother and father. and they were all doing that. It was just not when he was 30 years old he started keeping the law all of a sudden. He kept all of it, didn't he?
He did, and I think it's in Isaiah where it talks about how he from a child chose the good, right? You know, his walk with the Father was so unique, and I'm going to use the word complete. You know, how is it that Jesus lived a sinless life?
Father.
Because the Father walked with him, right? Paul is very clear in Hebrews that Jesus was fully human, and he was tempted in every way that we are tempted, but he always chose the good, even as a child. That's how he satisfied the righteous requirements of the law, was because of the presence of the Father coaching him and guiding him and instructing him from childhood. From childhood. But I want you to recognize in this verse here, in verse 18, that it's not just the law that has to be satisfied, it's all of the prophecies. And because there is a curse side to the law, and the nation itself is under the curse, although individuals can escape that both the new and the old covenants are running simultaneously under different conditions. And in reality, the new covenant is the satisfied righteous covenant, the righteous requirements of the old covenant through Christ. Right? He's the one who did it, and when we join ourselves to him, and we're considered righteous in God's eyes because we have put on Christ, like we have literally, not literally, figuratively clothed ourselves with him. And he continues on in verse 19. He says, whoever breaks the least of these commandments. Now, again, remember last week we talked about the three types of Christians in Romans 10, right? The spiritual or mature ones, the baby and immature ones, and then the carnal Christians. And I pointed out that Paul still calls these carnal Christians Christians. So that just because somebody makes innocent mistakes because they're immature, or maybe not so innocent mistakes because they're still carnal, yet they kind of know better, they're just not really good at being righteous, that per the law of Christ, that God is being patient and he's still working on them. Well, here in verse 19, Jesus himself says that anyone who breaks the least of his commandments and teaches others to do so still gets into the kingdom. He's just got to sit in the back row. Walter, you're muted again. Verse 19, whoever breaks the least of these commandments and teaches men to do so shall be called least in the kingdom. Walter, what were you going to say?
Actually, you said it.
Okay.
They're considered least in the kingdom,
Yeah.
but they're there.
But they're there. That's what I was saying. Like, they still get into the kingdom, but they're just like in the back row. They're in the back of the room. Like, I'd be happy with that.
That's okay. The janitors. That's all right.
Now, what this means is that it allows for, well-meaning but misguided Christians to experience God's mercy and grace in his judgment. God knows our failings and he covers our mistakes up to a point because there is a limit. And even some of the unfaithful servants or shepherds who teach bad doctrine will enter the kingdom. But in Luke 27 or Luke 12, you can read this on your own if you want. Luke 12, 47, 48 talks about the unfaithful servant who knows the will of his master and isn't prepared for him coming, saying that he is beaten with a few stripes, beaten with many stripes. So even well-intended pastors and teachers who teach wrong doctrine will get into the kingdom, but there will be a punishment for them.
But some won't.
Some won't make it.
Because of what they taught.
Or because of their motives, right? Because of their motives.
But who holds these people responsible? Are we supposed to hold the places where they were taught, if they're Bible colleges and their seminaries and all their theologians who misinform all these young people coming here who are called, they believe they're called to the ministry? Who's going to be held more responsible?
The leaders, I mean, always the leaders. The leaders are more responsible. Well, that's clear in Paul's warning to Timothy, or in one of the Timothy books, where he says, let not many people aspire to the role of a bishop or a teacher, because we shall be held to greater accountability. As you contemplate being sent into the world and not just being passively in the world, know that Jesus holds us accountable for what we know. In that parable of the faithful versus the unfaithful steward, Jesus said that to everyone to whom much is given, from him much will be required. And this is what allows somebody to become a Christian 2 months, 2 days, 2 minutes, 2 seconds before the sky splits open and still get into the kingdom. They've not lived a life of righteousness. They just made a decision at the right time. God is ultimately merciful in his judgment. Now, as verse 19 merges into verse 20, Jesus sets the bar. What's the standard for getting into the kingdom? What does he say? He says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees. So there's 2 issues here in this section, right? There's the standard of righteousness that we need to meet just simply to get in. And then there's our position or our status once we get in there. If you want to be great in the kingdom, how do you need to be here on earth? You need to be meek and humble in your salty life. And Jesus used that self-derived righteousness the Pharisees created themselves as the line that defines who gets in and who doesn't. Start making up your own rules. That's like a sure way out. Hypocrisy will keep you out. The Pharisees, who knew the will of their master, broke the commandments, modified the law with their own traditions, which they taught as law, and then they taught others to follow them. And so one of the fundamental rules of Christianity 101 is, if you don't do, don't teach. If you don't do, don't teach. God will judge a hypocrite more harshly than an immature, well-meaning Christian who's just making mistakes out of ignorance, or somebody who might be carnal who's working themselves out, as long as their attitude is right. Because we all know, listen, and I'm pointing fingers everywhere, including at myself. Every single one of us knows what it's like to know better and to do anyways. We all know that, don't we? And thank God he's patient with us. And thank God there's a process and there's resources that brings us through the growth to the point where the things that we struggled with before, we don't struggle with anymore. But there's always a struggle. I don't care who you are. You're struggling with something, me included. And again, just for clarification, when Jesus says, whoever breaks the least of these commandments, he's not referring to the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai or the expanded law of Moses. He's talking about what he's about to say with the 10 Commandments that he gives on the sermon, right? It points forward. It doesn't point backwards.
It's the antecedent.
Yeah.
I was wondering about that.
Back in the Old Testament, Moses was the lawgiver, right? But he wasn't the judge. But Jesus is both, right? He's the lawgiver and he's the judge. In fact, Peter points this out in Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 3. Go to Acts chapter 3 for a second. This is Peter's second sermon. This is after Pentecost. He and John are out at the temple, and Peter heals a lame man. I think it's at the Beautiful Gate. And people come flocking around them because they see this man who they knew was lame leaping about and praising God, right? And this is what Peter says to the people as they come to see the spectacle. In verse 22, Acts 3:22, for Moses truly said to the fathers, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. Him you shall hear in all things, whatever he says to you. And it shall be that every soul who will not hear that prophet, and he's referring to Jesus, shall be utterly destroyed from among the people. Yes, and all the prophets from Samuel and those who follow, as many have spoken, have also foretold these days. Skip down to verse 26. Now, actually, I'm sorry, let me read 25. You are sons of the prophets and of the covenant which God made with our fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. To you first, God, having raised up his servant Jesus, sent him to bless you, in turning away every one of you from your iniquities. Now, back in verse 23, Peter said, every soul who will not hear will be destroyed from among the nation. Now, it doesn't mean that those who have not heard the word or the message. The context of that word that's translated as hear, right? As hear him you shall hear all things, but every soul that will not hear the prophet, it's not hear in terms of audition, in terms of just registering sound with your ear and your temporal lobe. It literally means here heeding the words that you have heard, heeding the message. So Peter's saying to these Jews, like, listen, you just saw me heal this lame man with the power of God, and guess what? Jesus rose from the dead, and God sent him. The Father sent him. And the prophets prophesied about him. And he tells these Jews now in his second sermon that if they don't escape the curse of the law through Christ, they're going to be destroyed. Kind of hurts, doesn't it? Notice the solution in the last half of verse 26. He says, Jesus was sent to bless us. Now, all the name it and claim it people are going to be happy with that, right? Jesus is here to bless us. Well, they're going to be wrong, because the verse also tells us how he's going to bless us. Somebody tell me how Jesus was sent to bless us.
By turning everyone away from their iniquities.
Wow. Something the Pharisees refused to do, right? In fact, they dug their heels in when it came to Christ. In fact, there is indication in the scriptures that, Nicodemus, when Nicodemus came, he was a Pharisee, right? What did he say? He said, we know that you are from God. The we refers to some of the other Pharisees. So among the group of the Pharisees, some knew that he was the Christ. Yet they did what they did. The conclusion is that iniquities keep us from the kingdom. The solution is to be turned from your iniquities, and that in and of itself is a blessing from Christ. So, like I always do, somebody tell me what an iniquity is. Yeah?
Trespass or a sin?
Yeah, honestly, it has a range of meanings, but most often it's translated as wickedness. Jesus came to bless you in turning you from your wickedness. Now, it can also be translated, depending on context, as depravity or malice or plotting and scheming, and sometimes it's used for the word sin. And the idea that Peter is conveying here is that unrighteousness or lawlessness, the idea that he is conveying is unrighteousness. Although there is a specific word that is translated as unrighteous, but that's really what he's pointing to. And it's the opposite, like Vera said, I think it was Vera said, obedience, and that's kind of captured in this whole picture, right? God is asking for obedience to the truth of his word and the commandments that he gave us through his Son. Whether it's the 10 commandments that drive universal morality, or if it's the specific commandments that are given to his people. Listen, if you're going to call yourself after my name, if you're going to be part of my group and my tribe, you're going to be like this. And if you are lawless and you refuse to be obedient and you don't follow this path, you will be disinherited. but I will be patient with you as you work it out, and I will help you because I want you to stick around. I mean, that's essentially the message of the gospel. But this unrighteousness, these iniquities that keep us from the kingdom, these things that keep us away from God, remove us from his favor and from his blessings. And ultimately what Peter is telling the Jews in Acts 3 here is that, step number 1 to achieving or realizing the blessings of the kingdom is to stop being like you are and start being like Christ. Turn from your wickedness, be blessed by Christ, receive the promises of the kingdom. And that answers the question, when do the blessings come? They come in the kingdom. And it doesn't mean we can't experience blessings in the Christian life, but when you look at the promises of the covenants and the kingdom, or I should say, when you look at the promises of the covenants, they're all focused in the kingdom era. So whether we're looking at Peter's sermon here in Acts 3 or Christ's analogies of being salt and light, the Ten Commandments of Christ are about being a certain kind of person, the kind of person who grabs the attention of the Father, someone who pleases him by not just hearing, but heeding the words that were spoken by the Son. The new covenant that we're under, and some of the Jews are, which was foretold, Jeremiah 31:31, said that the new law would be written on people's hearts, right? And that's what it means when in Galatians 2, when Paul said he died to the law so he could live for God. And then he said, it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The law being written on our hearts is this internalization. It's adopting the words of the Father through the Son as commandments as our modus operandi. It's the motive that drives our behaviors and our choices. So Christ lives in our hearts because we choose to adopt his way over our way, which is, again, not what the Pharisees did. It becomes the very center of our passion, our motivation, and our drive. Now, Jesus isn't the only person who told God's people how they should act. Moses did that too. Just go back and read Deuteronomy. Focus on the last part, especially chapters 28 and 29. But as we wind down and set up for 2 weeks from now, we'll again not start on the Ten Commandments because we have to go through the Beatitudes. If you never thought about this, and I'm sure some of you have, but there are many parallels between Moses receiving the law on Mount Sinai and Jesus when it comes to kind of giving the law, right? Moses spent 40 days fasting on the mountain before he got the law. Jesus spent 40 days fasting in the wilderness before he gave the law. The pre-incarnate Christ gave the law to Moses on a mountain, and the incarnate Christ gave his disciples his new law on a mountain. The Old Testament law was given with a series of blessings. Jesus begins with the blessings of the Beatitude, or the Beatitudes. Moses came down off Mount Sinai to the golden calf incident, and he cleaned house, so to speak, and the Levites killed 3,000 people. The Jews who rose up to play. In John chapter 2, very early in Christ's ministry, not long after the Sermon on the Mount, he went into the temple the first time and drove out the money changers who had defiled his father's house, and he fashioned a whip to do it. There are these amazing parallels between Moses as the first lawgiver, understanding that Christ gave him the law, but we call Moses the first lawgiver, and then Jesus as the lawgiver in the New Testament. Two seminal events, and they're very, very, very clear. Let me finish with this. what we did today was we looked at the bookends of the commandments of Christ, right? We looked at a summary statement. We looked at the immediate prelude, the salt and light. We talked about fulfilling the law and the prophets. But before we get to the law, we have to talk about the Beatitudes, which is, Matthew 1 through 12. Matthew 5, 1 through 12. Anybody know what the word Beatitudes means?
Attitude you should be.
Well, that's where I'm going, Mary. Thank you very much. For you and I, the Beatitudes are the be attitudes. These are the attitudes that we are to adopt as Christians. Now, the word Beatitudes, it's an old word, but it just simply means blessings. So the next time we meet, we'll go through Matthew 5, 1 through 12. It's interesting because pretty much all of these blessings and all of these connections, like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. These are all taken from the Old Testament and used to introduce the new law.